I was sitting in the darkest corner of my sister's $100,000 wedding, my 5-year-old son trembling on my lap, when she took the microphone. She didn't just thank her guests. She looked right at me, smiled her perfect smile, and publicly called me a used single mom nobody wants. The entire ballroom gasped. But what she didn't know was that I had a thick manila folder in my purse, and her groom was about to use it to completely destroy her perfect life. For 34 years, I was the invisible scapegoat in a toxic, image-obsessed family. I was trained to take the abuse, lower my head, and stay completely silent. But that night, as my son wiped a tear from my cheek, I didn't hide. I fought back. And the secret I revealed didn't just stop a wedding, it exposed a felony. This story is a powerful reminder that blood does not give anyone the right to abuse you, and true strength is found in walking away from a toxic table. If you've ever had to set a hard boundary to protect your own peace, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a fun in the comments below. Let's show every woman watching that she is never walking this path alone. I was sitting at table 34, the absolute furthest corner of the grand, oceanfront ballroom in Newport, Rhode Island, when my younger sister, Victoria, took the microphone. The air in the room was heavy, suffocatingly sweet, with the scent of 10,000 imported white roses and the salty breeze drifting in off the Atlantic. I was 34 years old, a pediatric nurse and a former combat medic, yet sitting in that gilded room, surrounded by 300 of New England's most elite socialites. I felt entirely invisible. My 5-year-old son, Noah, was perched on my lap, his small hands playing quietly with the hem of my dress. It was a dull, oversized beige dress, specifically chosen and purchased for me by my mother, Eleanor. She had handed it to me weeks prior with a tight, sympathetic smile, whispering that I had let myself go since becoming a single mother, and that this matronly fabric would help me blend in without drawing any uncomfortable scrutiny. It was the language of love, weaponized to completely dismantle my self-esteem. The low murmur of the affluent crowd died down as Victoria tapped the side of her crystal champagne flute. She looked like an absolute vision, a porcelain doll draped in a custom-fitted silk gown that shimmered under the massive glass chandeliers. She was a lifestyle influencer, a woman who had built an entire digital empire on the aesthetics of perfection and toxic positivity. She smiled at the sea of guests, her expression softening into a mask of pure, angelic concern. "I want to dedicate this next toast to my older sister, Clara," Victoria announced, her voice echoing through the state-of-the-art sound system. "It takes a special kind of bravery to show up here today, as a used single mom nobody wants, dragging the heavy baggage of a failed life. Let us all raise a glass to her resilience, and pray she finds even a fraction of the happiness Thomas and I share." The cruelty was not delivered with a scream or a harsh tone. It was disguised entirely as pity, which made it infinitely more insidious. A collective, uncomfortable gasp rippled through the ballroom. 300 pairs of eyes shifted instantly toward the dark corner near the kitchen doors, locking onto me. My heart did not just break, it shattered against my ribs. The military had spent years training me to suppress panic, to lock my emotions away when under fire, but I was not in a war zone, and I was not a machine. I was a mother, and I was bleeding from a wound inflicted by my own flesh and blood. I felt the hot, stinging rush of tears welling in my eyes. I didn't try to stop them. Noah, sensing the sudden, crushing shift in the atmosphere, stopped playing with my dress. He looked up at my face, his large brown eyes reflecting absolute confusion. With a gentleness that broke me entirely, he reached up his small thumb and wiped a tear that had escaped down my cheek. My mother, Eleanor, was seated at the head table, sipping her Cabernet with a posture of perfect, unbothered elegance. My father, Richard, stared intently at his silver fork, willfully ignorant, choosing silence over defending his eldest daughter. They expected me to simply lower my head. They expected me to absorb the humiliation, to act as the convenient scapegoat so Victoria could shine just a little bit brighter. For 34 years, I had played that exact role. I had swallowed their passive, aggressive insults, accepted the scraps of affection they threw my way, and desperately tried to earn a seat at a table that was built to exclude me. But as Noah's tiny hand rested against my wet cheek, a profound and dangerous clarity washed over me. I reached down and placed my hand over the heavy, leather handbag sitting by my feet. Inside that bag was a thick manila folder. Just 3 weeks ago, while applying for a modest mortgage to finally move Noah out of our cramped apartment, a routine background credit check had flagged a massive financial anomaly. I had spent days tracking down the paper trail, pulling certified bank ledgers and authorized signatures. I discovered that a secure trust fund, left strictly and solely to me by my late grandmother to ensure Noah's future education, had been completely drained. The money had not gone to a charity. It had not been lost in a bad investment. It had been illegally accessed, through forged signatures, by Eleanor and Victoria. The very champagne these guests were drinking, the imported white roses suffocating the room, and the custom silk gown wrapping Victoria's body had all been paid for with money stolen directly from a 5-year-old boy. Sitting in the shadows of table 34, I took a slow, deep breath. The tears stopped falling. The crushing weight of lifelong inadequacy evaporated, replaced by the fierce, protective instinct of a mother who has finally been pushed past the point of no return. I looked past the Bastern crowd, past my mother's cold eyes, and locked my gaze directly onto the stage. I was no longer the broken, used singles mother they desperately wanted me to be. I was the storm that was about to level their carefully curated, $100,000 illusion to the ground. The silence in the ballroom stretched out, tight and fragile as glass, waiting for me to break. Victoria stood at the center of the stage, holding her champagne flute high, her painted lips curved into a triumphant, sympathetic smile. She turned gracefully toward Thomas, expecting him to pull her in for a picture-perfect kiss that would cement her narrative of superiority. Thomas, however, did not move toward her. He was a senior forensic accountant at one of Boston's most ruthless financial firms. A man who built his entire life on the principles of integrity, transparency, and hard data. He looked at Victoria, his face completely devoid of the adoration she so desperately craved. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas reached out and wrapped his hand around the microphone stem, pulling it away from her. Victoria talks a lot about charity, Thomas said, his voice a low, resonant baritone that cut through the stale air of the ballroom. He did not yell. He did not sound angry. He sounded entirely analytical, which made the impact devastating. She talks about how much she pities Clara, and how grateful she is for the life we are supposed to build. But what Victoria didn't tell any of you today is exactly how she managed to pay for the champagne you are all currently drinking. Victoria's bridal glow vanished instantly. Her jaw dropped, and a flash of genuine, unadulterated panic crossed her features. "Thomas, what are you doing?" she hissed, stepping closer to him, her fingers clawing at the sleeve of his tailored tuxedo. He ignored her completely. He looked past the sea of shocked faces, past the massive floral centerpieces, and his eyes found mine in the dark corner of the room. He gave me a single, firm nod. He was not trying to be my savior. He was simply opening the door, stepping aside so I could reclaim my own agency. My legs were trembling so violently I thought they might give out. But I stood up. I didn't hide my tear-stained face. I didn't try to look perfectly composed. I let 300 people see exactly what raw, human pain looked like. Because there is no shame in being wounded by the people who are supposed to protect you. I picked up the heavy manila folder from my bag, took Noah's small hand in mine, and began to walk. The crowd parted for us instantly, pulling their chairs back, pressing themselves against the linen-draped tables to give us a wide berth. I walked straight past my mother, whose Botox-frozen face had gone completely pale, her wineglass trembling in her grip. I did not walk up the stage stairs to confront Victoria. Instead, I stopped directly in front of table 1, where Thomas's parents both highly respected. Veteran corporate auditors were seated. I am so sorry to interrupt your evening, I said, my voice shaking at first, before finding its strength and echoing clearly across the dead silent room. I placed the thick manila folder directly onto the pristine white tablecloth in front of Thomas's father. That is a certified, notarized bank ledger from Boston Heritage Trust. My grandmother left a protected fund to ensure my son would have a safe, secure future 6 months ago. My mother and my sister forged my signature. I turned my body slightly, forcing myself to look directly up at Victoria, who was now trembling uncontrollably on the stage. They drained $150,000 to pay for this venue, the catering, and the designer dress you are wearing right now. You didn't just insult a single mother today, Victoria. You stole a future from a 5-year-old boy. Thomas's father flipped open the folder. With the trained, predatory speed of a career auditor, his eyes scanned the highlighted bank transfers, the copied checks, and the forged signature lines. He looked up at his son and gave a grim, definitive nod. The absolute destruction of my family's fake empire happened in a matter of seconds. The murmurs in the crowd erupted into a deafening roar of whispers and gasps. Eleanor stood up, desperately trying to grab the folder, stammering wild, incoherent excuses about a temporary family loan. But Thomas's mother firmly pulled the documents out of her reach, looking at Eleanor with sheer, absolute disgust. Up on the stage, Thomas stepped away from Victoria as if she were carrying a contagious disease. He looked at her one last time, his expression cold and final. "I am an accountant, Victoria," he said, speaking directly into the microphone so the entire room could hear the verdict. "You didn't just lie to me about who you are. You committed felony wire fraud. There will be no wedding today." He dropped the microphone onto the wooden podium. The heavy thud signaled the end of the war. I didn't stay to watch Victoria collapse onto the stage in a fit of hysterical tears. Nor did I stay to watch my parents drown in the public humiliation they had tried to force onto me. I tightened my grip on Noah's hand, turned my back on the chaos, and walked out through the heavy oak doors of the ballroom. As we stepped out into the crisp, salty Rhode Island air, there was no magical, instantaneous fix to my trauma. I still had months of therapy ahead of me, and a brutal legal battle to reclaim my son's money. But as I strapped Noah into his car seat and started the engine, I took a deep breath. For the first time in 34 years, the air filling my lungs finally belonged to me. The drive back from Newport to our cramped apartment in the Boston suburbs felt like crossing an invisible border between two entirely different worlds. For the first time in my life, the silence inside my rusted sedan was not a tense, suffocating absence of sound waiting to be shattered by an insult. It was a clean, breathable peace. Noah had fallen asleep in his car seat almost immediately, his small chest rising and falling in a steady, comforting rhythm. I kept my hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, watching the highway lines blur into the dark, feeling the adrenaline slowly drain from my muscles. I fully expected to feel a crushing sense of guilt, the deep-seated, programmed obligation to apologize for ruining the family's grand illusion. That was the script I had been forced to memorize since childhood. Clara takes the blame. Clara absorbs the anger. Clara apologizes for taking up space. But as I parked the car and carried my sleeping son up the 2 flights of stairs to our apartment, the guilt never came. Instead, I felt a profound, unwavering absolute certainty. The titanium chain that had tethered my self-worth to my mother's approval was finally, irreversibly broken. When the sun came up the next morning, the retaliatory strike began precisely as I knew it would. I sat at my small kitchen table with a mug of black coffee, watching my cell phone light up like a distress beacon. 74 missed calls, a tidal wave of text messages from Eleanor, Richard, and a handful of extended relatives who had clearly been given a highly fabricated version of the previous night's events. My mother's voicemails were a masterclass in psychological manipulation. The first few were frantic and aggressive, accusing me of being a bitter, jealous spinster who had manufactured a financial lie simply to destroy her younger sister's happiness. When the aggression failed to elicit a response from me, her tone drastically shifted. The subsequent voicemails were drenched in a weeping, victimized sorrow, begging me to remember that family forgives and that Victoria was currently heavily sedated in a hotel room, her life completely in ruins. Eleanor desperately wanted me to engage. She needed me to step back onto the battlefield so she could twist the narrative, confuse the facts, and ultimately force me into a quiet submission. I did not listen to the rest of the messages. I did not type out a furious, defensive paragraph attempting to justify my actions. Fighting with a narcissist is like firing ammunition into the ocean. It swallows your energy and leaves absolutely no mark. I took a slow sip of my coffee, opened my phone settings, and blocked my mother's number. Then I blocked my father's number. I blocked Victoria, my aunts, my uncles, and every single flying monkey who dared to reach out on their behalf. I enacted a total, uncompromising radio silence. It was not a punishment. It was a heavily fortified perimeter to protect my peace. Later that afternoon, the doorbell rang. It was not a furious family member attempting to breach the physical boundary, but a sharp-suited legal courier holding a heavy manila envelope. Thomas had been true to his unspoken word. The envelope contained the business card of a ruthless, highly recommended financial litigator in downtown Boston, specializing in trust fraud and asset recovery, along with a brief, handwritten note from Thomas that simply read, "Do not let them settle for an apology. Get every single cent back." The following Tuesday, I walked into the mahogany-paneled office of the litigator, Mr. Sterling. I did not shrink into the leather chair or apologize for taking up his time. I presented the forged documents, the banking timelines, and the Newport wedding receipts with the cold, clinical precision of an army medic delivering a triage report, Mr. Sterling was a man who dealt exclusively in hard data, and he recognized immediately that we held an undeniable winning hand. He explained that Victoria and Eleanor had committed a federal offense because the funds were wired across state lines to pay for the Rhode Island venue. It constituted wire fraud, carrying a penalty of severe restitution and potential prison time. He drafted a devastating legal injunction that very afternoon, effectively freezing all of Eleanor and Richard's personal assets and serving them with a formal notice of criminal liability. As I signed the heavy legal retainer, my hand did not shake. I was not doing this out of a petty desire for revenge. I was a mother fiercely protecting her child's future, standing guard at the gates, absolutely determined that the cycle of generational abuse would permanently end with me. The transition from late summer to a crisp, golden New England autumn mirrored the profound shift occurring within my own life. The fallout from the Newport wedding had been spectacular, brutal, and entirely public, despite Eleanor's desperate, manic attempts to spin the narrative within her elite social circles. The truth had spread with the ruthless efficiency of a wildfire. Thomas's family, who commanded massive respect in the financial echelons of Boston, made no secret of exactly why the wedding had been abruptly canceled. Victoria's carefully curated digital empire collapsed almost overnight. Her high-end lifestyle sponsors dropped her, terrified of the toxic public relations disaster of being associated with a woman who stole a 5-year-old's education fund to buy a designer gown. She was forced to abandon her luxury apartment and move back into my parents' sprawling, suffocating house, completely stripped of the superficial glamour she had worshipped her entire life. Eleanor was systematically uninvited from her prestigious charity boards and country club luncheons. The high society she had prioritized over her own eldest daughter cast her out into the cold, proving that a kingdom built on optics will eventually shatter under the weight of the truth. I did not witness their downfall in person, nor did I follow their demise on social media. I was entirely focused on the rigorous, unglamorous work of rebuilding my own mind. Every Thursday afternoon, I sat in the quiet, sunlit office of Dr. Evans, a brilliant trauma therapist who specialized in family dynamics and scapegoat conditioning. Therapy was not a magical, instantaneous cure. It was exhausting, painful work. I had to unlearn 34 years of survival tactics. The military had successfully taught me how to detach from physical pain and push through sheer exhaustion. But it had never taught me how to safely feel my own emotions without viewing them as a tactical liability. Dr. Evans gently forced me to confront the deep, jagged grief of realizing that I never truly had a mother or a sister. I cried in that office. I wept for the little girl who used to shrink into the shadows of her own home, constantly trying to make herself small enough to be loved. But with every tear I shed, the heavy, suffocating tightness in my chest grew slightly lighter. I was clearing the wreckage, preparing the ground to build something entirely new, something rooted in absolute truth. By late November, the legal battle reached its definitive conclusion. Terrified of the very real prospect of a criminal trial and federal prison, Eleanor and Victoria accepted a brutal civil settlement. They were legally compelled to liquidate a significant portion of Richard's retirement portfolio to pay back the stolen $150,000, plus all accrued legal fees and compensatory damages. The recovered funds were immediately transferred into a heavily guarded, ironclad trust fund for Noah, completely inaccessible to anyone but him upon his 18th birthday. On the day the final papers were signed, my father sent me a single, pathetic email. It contained 3 words: "I am sorry." I sat at my kitchen counter, staring at the glowing screen. I felt no anger, no pity, and absolutely no obligation to reply. An apology without accountability, without a fundamental change in behavior, is just another form of manipulation. I clicked the mouse, dragged the email directly into the digital trash bin, and permanently erased it from my life. That following spring, I finally used my hard-earned savings to close on a small, beautiful home in a quiet, tree-lined neighborhood. It was not a sprawling mansion, but it was structurally sound, bathed in warm natural light, and completely safe. On our first weekend in the new house, I stood in the kitchen, washing dishes while watching Noah through the window. He was running across the green grass of his very own backyard, laughing loudly, chasing a yellow butterfly without any fear of being shushed or scolded. I leaned against the counter, a profound sense of peace settling deep into my bones. Society often tries to paint single mothers as tragic figures, viewing us as broken women carrying the heavy burden of a fractured family. But as I watched my son thrive in the light of our hard-won freedom, I knew the absolute truth. I was not a used, discarded product. I was a warrior who had walked through the fire and emerged holding the only treasure that mattered. I had built a real family, not out of toxic bloodlines or expensive illusions, but out of resilience, safety, and a fierce, unconditional love. The passage of time in our new home did not simply heal the lingering wounds. It actively transformed them into the foundation of a fiercely independent life. As the vibrant New England spring melted into a lush, forgiving summer, I found myself pouring my renewed energy into my career as a pediatric nurse. For years, I had operated in survival mode, keeping my head down at the hospital, completing my shifts with a quiet, mechanical efficiency just to ensure the bills were paid. I had viewed my own existence as a burden, a mindset deeply ingrained in me by Eleanor's relentless conditioning. But shedding the dead weight of my family's toxic expectations unlocked a reservoir of professional confidence I never knew I possessed. I began speaking up in ward meetings, advocating passionately for the underprivileged families who came through our doors, and applying the high-stakes critical thinking I had mastered as an Army combat medic to revamp our trauma intake protocols. By the end of the year, I was promoted to the position of head charge nurse of the pediatric wing. I was no longer the invisible scapegoat hiding in the shadows of a gilded room. I was a respected leader, shaping an environment of genuine care and medical integrity. It was during this period of profound personal and professional growth that I saw Thomas one last time. It was not a romantic reunion, Nor was it the start of a fairy tale romance to replace the trauma I had endured. I did not need a man to save me, because I had already saved myself. We met at a quiet, unassuming coffee shop in downtown Boston to sign the final, notarized affidavits required to permanently close the fraud investigation against Victoria and Eleanor. Thomas looked different than he had on the day of the ruined wedding. The rigid, high-stress tension that had previously tightened his jaw was completely gone. As I slid the signed documents across the wooden table, he looked at me with a profound, quiet respect. He told me that Victoria had attempted to contact him several times, pleading for forgiveness and blaming her actions on a temporary lapse of judgment driven by wedding stress. Thomas had not responded to a single message. He looked at me, his coffee cup resting in his hands, and said that watching me stand up in that ballroom, armed only with the truth and a fierce love for my son, was the most remarkable act of courage he had ever witnessed. We shook hands outside the cafe, parting ways as equals two professionals who had navigated a disaster and emerged with our integrity intact. It was a deeply necessary closure, a final severing of the last remaining thread that connected me to the Newport nightmare. The greatest triumph, however, was not my promotion or the legal victories. It was the quiet, unremarkable evenings spent inside the four walls of my own home with Noah. I became acutely aware of the generational cycles I was actively breaking every single day. When Noah accidentally dropped a glass of milk on the kitchen floor, shattering it into a dozen pieces, he did not flinch. He did not cower in terror or wait for a barrage of screaming insults, because he had never been taught to fear his own mother. Instead of unleashing the kind of verbal abuse Eleanor would have rained down on me for a simple mistake, I knelt beside him with a towel. I told him it was just an accident, that objects can be replaced. But he was what mattered. We cleaned up the spill together, turning a potential trauma into a quiet lesson in responsibility and grace. I was meticulously engineering a childhood for him that was the exact opposite of my own. I was filling his world with patience, open communication, and the undeniable certainty that he was unconditionally loved. I was not just raising a son. I was actively rewriting the genetic code of our family tree, ensuring that the poison of the past would never infect his future. As the years began to stack one on top of the other, the memory of that extravagant, suffocating wedding faded into a distant, faded photograph. The sharp, agonizing sting of my sister's cruel words lost their power entirely, rendered obsolete by the undeniable reality of my success. I had taken the absolute worst of their abuse, the public humiliation, the financial betrayal, and the profound rejection, and I had used it as the very mortar to build an impenetrable fortress of peace. I was no longer the frightened girl trying to earn a seat at a table where I was despised. I had built my own table, and I was the one who decided who was worthy of pulling up a chair. Noah's 8th birthday fell on a brilliantly clear, crisp October afternoon, and the contrast between this celebration and the lavish, toxic events of my past could not have been more profound. There were no imported white roses, no $100 bottles of champagne, and absolutely no underlying currents of manipulation or deceit. Instead, our backyard was filled with the scent of burning charcoal, the loud, joyous laughter of little boys running through the fallen autumn leaves, and the warm, genuine conversation of our chosen family. I had invited my fellow nurses from the pediatric ward, neighbors who had become trusted friends, and the parents of Noah's schoolmates. Looking around the yard, watching my son blow out the candles on a slightly lopsided, homemade chocolate cake, I realized that bloodlines do not dictate family. True family is forged in the fires of mutual respect, safety, and unwavering support. The people standing in my backyard did not care about social status or country club memberships. They cared about us. They loved us for exactly who we were, without conditions or demanding a performance in return. Later that evening, after the guests had gone home and Noah was fast asleep in his room, I sat alone on the back porch, wrapped in a thick wool blanket. The night air was sharp and clean. In the quiet solitude, My mind briefly drifted back to the phrase Victoria had weaponized against me on that stage in Newport, a used single mom nobody wants. For a long time, society had echoed that exact sentiment, treating single mothers as cautionary tales, branding us with a quiet, persistent stigma that suggested we were somehow broken, incomplete, or fundamentally flawed. We are often portrayed as women who are merely surviving the wreckage of a failed life, heavily burdened and desperately waiting for someone to come along and make us whole again. But sitting under the vast, starlit sky, feeling the solid wood of my own house behind me, I realized just how catastrophic that lie truly is. Being a single mother is not a testament to failure. It is an undeniable testament to a fierce, unrelenting valor. It means carrying the immense, crushing weight of two parents with the physical and emotional strength of one. It means facing a world that is fundamentally designed to work against you, and choosing to rise every single morning to build a sanctuary for your child anyway. If there is any truth to be extracted from the agonizing journey I was forced to walk, it is a truth rooted deeply in the fundamental right to human dignity. We are taught, almost from birth, that family is an unbreakable bond, that we must endlessly forgive and absorb the cruelty of those who share our DNA. But abuse does not suddenly become acceptable just because it is wrapped in a family title. Psychological manipulation, financial theft, and public humiliation are acts of violence, regardless of whether they are committed by a stranger or by your own mother. You have an absolute, unalienable right to protect your peace. Setting a hard, uncompromising boundary with toxic family members is not an act of bitterness or rebellion. It is the highest form of self-respect. It is the courageous declaration that your mental health, your physical safety, and the emotional well-being of your children are far more important than keeping up the polite, suffocating appearances of a dysfunctional system. The scars of my past will always be a part of my architecture. The memories of being the invisible, unloved scapegoat do not magically disappear, but they no longer define the trajectory of my life. I am no longer waiting for the people who broke me to offer an apology they are entirely incapable of giving. My worth has never been, and will never be, defined by someone else's inability to love me. I am a combat medic, a dedicated pediatric nurse, a survivor of profound emotional abuse, and above all else, I am Noah's mother. I took the shattered, discarded pieces of my life, and I forged a masterpiece of resilience and quiet joy. And to anyone still sitting in the dark corner of a room, listening to the people who are supposed to love you tear you down, I offer this final, unwavering promise. You do not have to stay. You are infinitely stronger than the cages they try to put you in. Walk away, step into the light, and never look back. 5 years had passed since the catastrophic events in the Newport ballroom, and the passage of time had forged a breathtaking new reality for Noah and me. Noah was now 10 years old, a bright, deeply empathetic boy who played Little League baseball and possessed a laugh that could effortlessly fill the entire house with warmth. My career had continued its upward trajectory. I was now the director of pediatric nursing at a major metropolitan hospital, managing a staff of 50 nurses and overseeing critical care protocols. My days were consumed by the intense, high-stakes reality of saving children's lives, an environment where absolute truth, precision, and genuine compassion were the only currencies that mattered. The contrast between my daily life and the superficial, image-obsessed world my family inhabited had never been more stark. I had built a fortress of authenticity, completely insulated from the toxic theater of my past, but trauma, especially the kind inflicted by a deeply narcissistic family structure, rarely surrenders without attempting one final, desperate siege. The intrusion arrived on a rainy Tuesday evening in late November, disguised as a pale pink envelope sitting innocuously in my heavy metal mailbox. I recognized the elegant, looping cursive handwriting immediately. It was Victoria. My heart, which would have once hammered fiercely against my ribs in a state of absolute panic, maintained a slow, steady rhythm. I carried the envelope inside, set my dressing bag on the kitchen island, and poured myself a glass of water. I did not tear it open with anxious dread. I stood in the quiet warmth of my kitchen, listening to the rain tap against the glass, and calmly sliced the envelope open with a butter knife. The letter inside was 3 pages long, written on expensive, heavy cardstock. It was a masterclass in the psychological tactic known as hoovering, the calculated attempt by an abuser to suck their victim back into the toxic cycle after a prolonged period of no contact. As I read Victoria's words, I analyzed them not as a wounded sister, but with the clinical detachment of a triage nurse assessing a textbook pathology. The letter was saturated in toxic positivity and manufactured victimhood. She wrote that she had spent the last 5 years doing deep spiritual work, and that her heart was finally ready to forgive me for the horrific scene I had caused at her wedding. The audacity of her phrasing was almost fascinating. She entirely omitted the fact that she had committed felony wire fraud, stolen a child's trust fund, and publicly humiliated me on a microphone. Instead, she framed herself as the gracious, injured party extending a benevolent olive branch. She mentioned that our mother, Eleanor, was experiencing minor health issues, deploying the classic weapon of familial guilt, stating that life was too short to hold on to bitter grudges. Victoria concluded the letter by suggesting we meet for a private, quiet lunch to heal the divide and act like a real family again. There was a time in my life, during my 20s, when a letter like this would have emotionally devastated me. It would have triggered a desperate, people-pleasing reflex, a frantic desire to apologize, to smooth things over, and to eagerly accept whatever crumbs of affection they were willing to offer, even if those crumbs were laced with poison. Society is deeply conditioned to push the narrative of unconditional forgiveness when it comes to blood relatives. We are constantly told to be the bigger person, to let things go, and to remember that family is family. But staring at the pink cardstock, I recognize that toxic forgiveness is simply a demand for the victim to quietly return to the slaughterhouse so the abuser can feel comfortable again. I did not feel a single ounce of guilt. I did not feel a sudden, sentimental longing for a sister who had never actually existed outside of my own desperate imagination. The most profound realization washed over me in that quiet kitchen. I felt absolutely nothing for her. The opposite of love is not anger or hatred. The opposite of love is complete and total indifference. I did not write a furious reply outlining her crimes. I did not call the number listed at the bottom of the page to demand an authentic apology. Engaging with a narcissist simply provides them with the emotional supply they are desperately seeking. They crave your anger just as much as they crave your submission, because any reaction confirms that they still hold power over your mind. I refused to surrender even a fraction of my hard-won peace. I walked over to the home office in the corner of my living room, turned on the electric paper shredder, and fed the pale pink cardstock directly into the steel blades. The machine whirred loudly, reducing 3 pages of calculated manipulation into tiny, meaningless ribbons of confetti in less than 10 seconds. I emptied the shredder bin into the trash, washed my hands, and walked upstairs to help Noah with his 5th-grade science project. The heavy, iron gate of my life remained firmly locked, and the ghost of my past had finally been exorcised for good. That evening, after finishing his homework, Noah and I sat together on the living room rug, surrounded by colored pencils and a massive poster board. His assignment was to chart the history of his family, mapping out the fundamental values that defined our household. He had drawn a large, sturdy oak tree, its deep roots gripping the earth, its wide branches stretching upward toward a bright yellow sun. On the leaves, he had carefully written words in his neat, childhood handwriting: honesty, safety, courage, kindness. There were no branches extending out into the void of the Rhode Island social scene. There were no names of grandparents who viewed him as an inconvenience, or an aunt who viewed him as collateral damage. The tree consisted entirely of the two of us, supported by the deep, nutrient-rich soil of the chosen family we had built over the last 5 years. looking at his beautiful, unburdened artwork. The overarching purpose of my entire painful journey crystallized with absolute clarity. I had not just survived a toxic family. I had successfully shielded the next generation from ever knowing its sting. To the woman who might be reading or listening to my story right now, the woman sitting in her car before walking into a house where she feels entirely invisible, or the single mother lying awake at night wondering if she has completely ruined her children's lives, I need you to hear my voice cutting through the darkness. The world will constantly try to tell you that setting boundaries makes you cold, that choosing your own mental health over family loyalty makes you selfish, and that raising a child alone is a profound tragedy. They will attempt to label you as a used product, a failure, or a burden. Do not let their brokenness dictate your reality. Your worth is an inherent, unalienable human right, not a conditional privilege granted by the people who share your last name. You possess an absolute, fundamental right to emotional safety, and demanding that safety is the most fiercely loving act a mother can ever perform. The path to healing is not a beautifully cinematic montage. It is a brutal, exhausting excavation of your own soul. It requires you to mourn the family you desperately deserved but never actually had. It requires you to stand in the center of a crowded room, look directly into the eyes of your abusers, and refuse to play the role of the silent punching bag ever again. You will lose people. You will lose the illusion of a cohesive family unit. You will lose the superficial approval of society. And you will lose the comfortable, familiar rhythm of your own subjugation. But what you gain in return is a life of breathtaking, uncompromised truth. You gain a home where the air is light, where footsteps on the stairs do not trigger a trauma response, and where your children can grow up knowing that love is supposed to feel like a safe harbor, not a battlefield. I look back at the 34-year-old woman sitting in the dark corner of that Newport ballroom, wearing a cheap, beige dress, trembling under the weight of $100,000 insult. I wish I could reach back through time, place my hands on her shaking shoulders, and tell her exactly how this story ends. I would tell her that the tears she is crying are not a sign of weakness, but the very water that will eventually grow her freedom. The legacy I am leaving for Noah is not a massive corporate trust fund, nor is it a prestigious family name deeply entrenched in New England high society. My legacy is the absolute certainty that human dignity is non-negotiable. It is the lesson that true strength is found in the courage to walk away from a toxic table, and the resilience to build your own. We are not defined by the cruelty of the people who tried to break us. We are defined by the exquisite, unbreakable grace with which we put ourselves back together. The true measure of healing is not merely found in the absence of our own pain, but in our capacity to recognize and alleviate the suffering of others. By my early 40s, my role as director of pediatric nursing had evolved into something far more profound than administrative oversight. I had spent years meticulously redesigning the intake protocols at our metropolitan hospital, specifically training my staff to identify the subtle, non-physical signs of familial and domestic abuse. We are culturally conditioned to look for bruised arms and fractured ribs, but I knew intimately that the most devastating injuries are often completely invisible to the naked eye. They manifest in the anxious, hyper-vigilant posture of a young mother, the frantic apologies for things that require no apology, and the terrifyingly blank stare of a woman who has been systematically convinced that she is entirely worthless. I had lived in that exact psychological prison for over 3 decades, and because I knew the precise architecture of its walls, I also knew exactly how to help other women find the hidden exit. It happened on a chaotic Thursday afternoon in the middle of a brutal winter flu season. I was walking through the crowded pediatric waiting room when a specific, razor-sharp tone of voice instantly froze the blood in my veins. It was a tone drenched in aristocratic condescension, a weaponized whisper designed to inflict maximum psychological damage without drawing the attention of the surrounding crowd. I turned my head and saw a young woman, perhaps 22 years old, sitting on a plastic chair while holding a feverish toddler against her chest. She was wearing a faded, oversized sweater, looking utterly exhausted and visibly trembling. Standing directly over her was an older woman, her mother dressed in an impeccable, expensive wool coat. The older woman was not comforting her daughter. She was actively dismantling her. If you had just listened to me and stayed with Mark, you wouldn't be sitting in a public clinic like a beggar, the older woman hissed, her manicured finger jabbing the air. You are a complete embarrassment. Look at you. A single mother who cannot even afford basic health care for her child. You ruin everything you touch. The young woman did not defend herself. She simply lowered her head, absorbing the venom with the practiced, devastating obedience of a lifelong scapegoat. She squeezed her eyes shut, desperately trying to hold back her tears in a public space, convinced that if she cried, she would only validate her mother's cruel narrative. A fierce, protective fire ignited instantly within my chest. I did not see a stranger sitting in that waiting room. I saw myself, 15 years ago, trembling under the crushing weight of Eleanor's narcissistic tyranny. I walked directly over to the triage desk, pulled a private consultation room key, and approached them with the absolute, unyielding authority of a senior medical professional. I informed the older woman that hospital policy required me to take the mother and child into a sterile room for a vital signs assessment, and that she would have to remain in the waiting area. The older woman puffed up her chest, ready to argue and assert her dominance. But I locked eyes with her and held my ground. I did not blink. Bullies, whether they are schoolyard children or wealthy matriarchs, always recognize when they have encountered an immovable wall, she scoffed, crossing her arms, and sat down. I guided the young woman, whose name was Maya, into the quiet, soundproof consultation room and gently closed the door. The moment the latch clicked, the heavy, oppressive atmosphere evaporated. Maya clutched her sleeping toddler and finally began to weep, apologizing profusely for taking up my time, apologizing for her mother's behavior, apologizing simply for existing. I walked over to the medical supply cabinet, poured her a cup of cold water, and handed her a box of tissues. I did not offer her medical advice right away. I pulled up a rolling stool, sat directly in front of her, and looked her dead in the eyes. You do not have to apologize to me, I said, my voice steady and warm. And you do not have to believe the lies that woman is whispering into your ear. You are not a failure because you left a bad situation. Maya, you are a fiercely courageous mother who is protecting her child, and her inability to see your worth does not decrease your value. Maya stopped crying and stared at me, completely stunned. It was the first time in her life a figure of authority had ever validated her reality, instead of dismissing it. I reached into my pocket and pulled out a card for a highly secure, heavily resourced women's advocacy center that I partnered with, along with my own personal cell phone number. I spent the next 20 minutes sitting with her, not just assessing her child's fever, but fundamentally rebuilding her shattered perspective. I shared a brief, sanitized fraction of my own story, proving to her that the dark, suffocating tunnel she was currently walking through actually had an end. I watched the profound transformation happen in real time, the precise moment a spark of defiance flickered to life in her tired eyes. When Maya walked out of that room, she held her head an inch higher. She did not look at her mother. She simply walked out the front doors of the clinic, carrying her child toward a new beginning. That is the true power of surviving the fire. You become the guiding light for those still trapped in the burning building. The ultimate vindication of my journey did not arrive with fanfare or a dramatic confrontation. It arrived on a quiet, sun-drenched Tuesday morning in late May, exactly 13 years after the fateful wedding in Newport. Noah had just turned 18 years old. He was no longer the small, terrified 5-year-old boy who had sat on my lap in a beige dress, trembling at the sound of his aunt's cruel laughter. He had grown into a remarkable young man, a brilliant, compassionate high school senior who was set to attend a prestigious university in the fall on a partial academic scholarship. We drove downtown together, navigating the familiar Boston traffic, and pulled up to the imposing glass-fronted building that housed the law offices of Mr. Sterling. The same ruthless financial litigator who had terrified my mother and sister into a settlement over a decade ago was waiting for us in his mahogany-paneled boardroom. The purpose of our visit was monumental. The heavily guarded, ironclad trust fund that we had recovered from the wreckage of Eleanor and Victoria's felony wire fraud had finally reached its maturity date. Because the funds had been placed into an aggressive, high-yield growth portfolio under Mr. Sterling's strict supervision, the original $150,000 had multiplied significantly. As we sat across the polished wooden table, Mr. Sterling slid a thick stack of finalized financial documents toward Noah, the lawyer, who usually maintained a stoic, intimidating demeanor, actually offered a genuine, warm smile. He looked at me, then looked at Noah, and explained that the money sitting in this account was now completely under his legal control. It was enough to cover his entire university tuition, secure a down payment on a future home, and ensure that he would start his adult life entirely debt-free. Noah picked up the heavy black pen to sign the transfer authorizations, but before the ink touched the paper, he stopped. He set the pen down, turned in his leather chair, and looked directly at me. His large brown eyes held a depth of understanding and profound gratitude that words could barely encompass. "I know exactly what it cost you to secure this for me, Mom," Noah said, his voice thick with emotion but entirely steady. "I know you had to walk through absolute hell. You let your own family hate you. You let them drag your name through the mud. And you stood entirely alone just to make sure I would be safe. This isn't just a bank account to me. This is the physical proof that you loved me more than you feared them." He reached across the table and took my hand, his grip strong and reassuring. "I am going to make you so proud. I promise you. I will never let anyone make me feel small. Because I was raised by the strongest woman on earth." Tears streamed silently down my face. But they were not tears of grief or exhaustion. They were tears of absolute, overwhelming victory in that sterile, corporate boardroom. The generational curse of the Poole family was officially, permanently eradicated. The wealth that my mother and sister had tried to steal to fund a superficial, fake empire of white roses and champagne had ultimately been transformed into the solid, unshakable foundation of my son's actual future. I had done my job. I had stood in the gap, absorbed the incoming fire, and successfully escorted my child across the battlefield into the light. When we walked out of the law firm and stepped onto the bustling Boston sidewalk, the sun felt incredibly warm against my skin. I did not look back at the building, and I did not look back at my past. The slate was completely clean. To the women watching this, the mothers who are exhausted, the daughters who have had to orphan in themselves to survive, and the women who have been told they are completely unlovable. Look at my life and know that the narrative they wrote for you is a lie. They want you to believe that without their conditional, toxic love, you will perish in the wilderness. The truth is, the wilderness is where you will finally learn how to breathe. You have an absolute, inherent right to live a life free from manipulation, gaslighting, and emotional theft. Do not ever apologize for setting a boundary that protects your soul. Do not ever let a society obsessed with the illusion of the perfect family shame you into enduring abuse. You are the architect of your own destiny. You have the power to break the chains, to rewrite the genetic code of your lineage, and to build a table where only love, respect, and profound honesty are served. It will be terrifying. You will lose people. But the peace you will find on the other side of that fear is a treasure that no one can ever steal from you. Stand your ground. Protect your peace. And remember that a woman who refuses to be broken is the most dangerous, beautiful force on this earth. Thank you for walking this incredible journey with me. Stay fiercely strong. Know your absolute worth, and never, ever settle for anything less than the respect you so deeply deserve. As we reach the end of this story, I want to take a moment to speak directly to anyone who recognized a piece of themselves in Clara's journey today. If you are sitting in your car right now dreading a family gathering, or if you are a single mother lying awake at night wondering if you are enough for your children, please listen to me carefully. Society often pushes a very dangerous narrative. We are told that family is family, and that we must endlessly forgive and absorb the cruelty of the people who share our DNA. But psychological manipulation, financial abuse, and public humiliation are acts of violence. A wedding invitation or a shared last name does not give anyone a free pass to destroy your mental health. You have an absolute, unalienable right to protect your peace. Setting a hard, uncompromising boundary with toxic family members is not an act of bitterness. It is the highest, most profound form of self-respect. And for the single mothers watching this, you are not a used product. You are not a failure. And you are certainly not a burden. You are carrying the immense weight of two parents with the physical and emotional strength of one. That is not a tragedy. That is absolute valor. Healing is not a magical, overnight process. It requires you to mourn the family you desperately deserved but never actually had. You might lose the illusion of a perfect family picture, but what you gain is a life of breathtaking, uncompromised truth. You gain a home where the air is light, where footsteps don't trigger panic, and where your children learn that love is a safe harbor, not a battlefield. You are the architect of your own destiny. You have the power to break the generational chains, walk away from the toxicity, and build your own table. Stay fiercely strong, know your absolute worth, and never settle for anything less than the respect you deserve. This content has been researched, developed, and edited manually by us to provide meaning and lessons.